we're setting up for a session down here. I've got my band DEACON KNIGHT coming by today. We're going to be tracking some drums and bass for a new single that we've got coming out pretty soon. And my good friend and bandmate, Philip Conrad, came down a little early, so I figured we would take this opportunity to make a video that I've been wanting to make for a really long time, which is basically how to play bass, but for guitar players. We're going to talk about the fundamentals of bass and what makes it unique and how to approach the instrument if you're coming from guitar, because when I started playing bass around 5 years ago, I had no idea what I was doing, and I actually just forgot about this until Phil reminded me, but I started playing bass because I had to fill in for him on a gig like a week later.
Yeah, thanks, buddy. Thanks for taking one for the team.
Yeah, he's like, hey, man, I'm not going to be able to play this show. I need you to play bass. I was like, cool, I got it. And I didn't realize that it was actually in front of like 2,500 people at a festival in North Carolina. So
yeah, apparently it went great. So
I think it went. I don't know that it went great, but we did something. Okay, so the biggest question that needs answering, how do you not sound like a guitar player trying to play bass?
I think play less. Just the way sound frequencies work, more information on the bottom end, it won't translate the same way it will in a higher octave, right? So a lot of guitar players will play like lines, like fast, cool pentatonic riffs and lines. You really have to consolidate all of your ideas and boil them down into the simplest thing you can think of and play that. I think it's a role thing, right? Like, do you remember when you were a kid and you would play on the trampoline, and if you timed it right, your friend could jump at just the right time and then launch you like twice as high?
Yeah.
A bass player is that friend. A good bass player can launch a soloist or a singer to like a new musical place they've never been to by intentionally creating a musical feeling and motion to launch them off. So think about it like that. Think about it, how can I make everybody else sound better than they ever have? And then play that, which is usually playing less.
I remember the thing that I had the biggest trouble with when I was starting to play bass, I was trying to prep for that gig in 1 week, was figuring out, like, switching from the pick to the fingers. Because guitar players, we don't play guitar like this, right? Where most of your bass stuff is like this. So what's like the first thing you would tell someone who's just starting off, a guitar player that just got their first bass, where would they start?
Like, a huge part of your tone for a bass player is in your hand tone, right, in both hands, but especially your right hand, that attack. So we're not picking, right? You can pick on a bass, but the maximum amount of surface area contact with flesh to string, right, to get like a good round sound. And I would like just put on a metronome and just real slow, careful, just practice following through and trying to get your index and your middle fingers to sound as close to each other as you can, right? I think that's a sign of a beginner bass player, is you can hear like a stutter when they alternate fingers. You want to try and get it nice and smooth and steady. I like to play a slight angle because, you know, your middle finger's a little longer than your index. I like to, and I would try and anchor your thumb on the pickup to start with. If you're playing on the E string, follow through and hit your thumb. Nice and steady and smooth between. And then if you go up to the A string, follow through and hit the E. And what that's doing is it's muting the E. So I think a big part of bass playing we need to think about. With guitar, it's cool to let big chords ring out, right? But with bass, it gets super muddy if you have multiple strings ringing at the same time. So really working on your muting will help you, help it sound cleaner, help it sound tighter. And when you say muting, because a guitar player, when they hear muting, the first thing they're going to think about is like palm muting in the right hand. Yeah. But that's not necessarily the same on bass. Yeah, some of those techniques can apply, but what I'm talking about is making sure that at any given time when you're playing a note on a bass, let's say it's a 4-string bass like this, right? 1 string is open and 3 strings are muted. Right. So by using both your left and your right hands, you're always making sure that the 3 other strings aren't ringing. Because then if you're, like, especially if you're like playing on a big stage with subwoofers, if you have like a random D string that's open and ringing while you're playing the E string, it's just going to sound like garbage. It's going to just get away from you. Yeah. So keeping it controlled. So like always muting when you're following through, you're muting the string below, and then in my left hand, I'm muting the strings above, right? So if I'm playing on let's say I'm playing this C on the 3rd fret of the A string. Right? I'm following through. I'm muting with my thumb on the E string, and if you look at my left hand, I have my index resting on the D and the G string. Right? So all of my strings are muted except for the one that I'm playing. So you get, the only thing you hear is just that note. And then when it gets tricky is when you're shifting between strings, right? When you're playing lines. So you kind of have to build some muscle memory to know how to mute when you're jumping and playing lines. But then if you can do that, it makes your sound a lot cleaner.
So with guitar, a similar thing is like if I'm playing really hard in my right hand, but I only want to target one note. Like all that stuff, even though I'm digging in here, it's all just muting every other note just with my first and the finger and thumb, right? So the bass is the same way. Now, in terms of where to go on the fretboard, because as guitar players, we're not used to only having 4 strings. And when it comes to understanding where you can go on the fretboard, you know, we're used to thinking more vertically, like up and down the neck, whereas I think most bass players are thinking more horizontally, right?
Yeah, sure. I'm just, for the sake of exercise, I'm just going to take this off, because just for a visual example, like most bass lines, you don't even need that. I'd say the sweet spot, and I'm talking about playing bass, not the instrument, but the roll, right? It's interesting that bass is both a frequency and the name of an instrument and a roll. I would say the sweet spot is mostly these 3 strings and mostly kind of in this land. And I would say really learn your octaves. Like, you can play a low E, you can play the E here, you can play the E here. They all have a different sound. Same thing as like the D here and here sound different than this open. If you're in doubt, I would try and find the lowest octave of the root of the chord and play it on the downbeat and start there. If you do that and you lock with the kick drum, you're probably doing okay to start with. You can always build from there, but that's a good default.
So we're going to talk about playing with a drummer, which I think is probably arguably the most important part of learning to play bass. For our drummer, we have my new assistant, Chris. He's been helping me out with the YouTube channel for the last couple weeks, and as well as being a great guitar player, he's also a drummer and great piano player. So Phil, what would you tell somebody who was just starting out?
Playing with the drummer as a bass player is super fun. It's almost like the two of you together are one instrument. Like as the rhythm section, you're creating this cool groove thing that exists and interlocks together to be a bed for everyone else to play on top of. A good place to start as a bass player is really listening to the kick drum pattern, because that is the drum note that is going to be down in your land, right? As a bass player, you need to be aware of that kick pattern so you can lock with it, or you can play around it, but you need to definitely know what that pattern is. An easy thing you can do is just turn the treble down on your stereo and just listen to the low frequencies. That's also a great way to listen to bass lines if you're not used to listening for bass lines. Also be really aware of the hi-hat, because that is keeping the time, and that's creating the grid, the musical grid that's subdividing the measures, right? So Chris is playing a nice steady groove for us, pretty meat and potatoes, but I'm listening for that kick drum. So we're gonna count 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1, 3 and that's that pulse. So if I'm gonna start with a groove, we'll pick a key and I'll say we'll start with G. If I was gonna do the most basic thing, I would just play 1 and 2 and 3 and I would really focus on locking with Chris. So Chris, you wanna jump in? And I'll just, maybe what I'll do is I'll start there and I can start to build and change the line and start to morph it, and you can start to listen for ideas on how you can build out a line. Great. Okay, cool. So as a bass player, you want to be true to the heartbeat, and you want to keep that pulse going. And if you're going to add or change, do it in a way that's going to still keep that going on, and do it in a way that's going to keep the groove interesting and stay in the spirit of the groove.
Stand by for ears. Coming in.
For ears. Ears. 3, 2, go ears.
Go ears.
Oh, I have certain death. Okay.
So let's talk gear. Take me through a few different... Oh my... Are you okay?
No, I'm all tangled.
So let's talk a few different things. Like, what are the fundamentals that guitar players need to know in regards to bass gear, like rounds versus flat, short scale versus medium scale, etc.?
Okay, cool. You don't need to spend a lot of money to get started with a pretty good bass sound. I think a good place to start is a P bass. It's a super classic sound. It's the most recorded bass in history. It's very versatile. You can play a lot of styles of music with it. It's comfortable to play.
Not sponsored, by the way. That's my bass I got like 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah, I'm not sponsored by Fender either. They just make good basses, and they have for a long time. So a P bass is a great place to start. This has rounds on it.
So what do you mean rounds? Explain that.
Okay, so when you think about strings, it's basically a wire with another wire wrapped around it, right? Rounds are brighter, they're snappier, they're punchier sounding, they're crunchy sounding, they have a lot more high-end information. They can also sound potentially clacky or unpleasant depending on how you play them. Flats, on the other hand, I'll switch out. This is my P bass.
Yeah, this is probably my favorite bass I've ever played. What's the story on this guy?
This is a 66 P bass. I bought it when I was first starting to really take bass playing seriously and wanting to do it as a career. About 10 years ago, I bought this bass. And I actually got it from an older guy that had arthritis, and he couldn't really play it anymore. He wanted it to find a good home, and he gave me a really good deal on it. So it's a 66 body. Somebody in the 80s switched out for active pickups, so I ended up putting Fralin pickups in here because I really like the way Fralin sound. But everything else is original. But what I was going to tell you was I have flats on here. Visualize a ribbon wrapped around a wire. So instead of having these little grooves where the wire touches the wire going down the string, it's flat. So if you look at this and run your finger down it, you don't hear that sound, right? It's because it's totally smooth. But if you think about the sound of flats, like, it's a pretty old school sound. It's like a lot of the recordings in the 60s, classic soul, a lot of them were recorded with flat wounds.
Let's talk scale length.
Okay, so this is a full scale P bass. This is a Mustang. I'm gonna put them on top of each other. You can see the difference in the scale length. It's just a little bit, everything's a little bit more consolidated. I had a bad hand injury a few years ago, so I started playing the Mustang because it made it easier for me to play. It was less taxing because I didn't have to navigate as much up and down the neck. I think it has a really cool sound. I kind of fell in love with the sound after I started playing it. It has a lot of sustain. It has naturally a sort of scooped mids. It has a lot of low information, and it has a very clear top end. It has a lot of definition of where the note is. It lends itself well to flats. I have flats on here as well because it's a very biting, like in your face sort of bass. So mellowing it out again with the flats, I think is a successful sound. And also for guitar players, it'll feel a little more comfortable for you. It's closer to the scale you're used to.
Yeah, I love short scale basses. They do feel way more comfortable making the transition from a guitar to something like the Mustang, because if you've never played a full-scale bass, it's a little weird, man. You feel like you're really reaching out into space to get down to like the F and F sharp on the low E string, and so the short scale is a little bit more comfortable, I think.
I didn't bring a jazz bass. I probably should have, but it's actually a pretty lifelong debate among bassists of jazz bass versus P bass. I don't know if you want to talk about that at all, but
I mean, the jazz bass, it's just a different sound completely. It's like the difference between a Fender Telecaster and a Les Paul, almost. I mean, the differences are pretty much that far apart. There's a lot of options out there.
And if you're on a budget, what I would say is find some used basses, Mexican-made Fenders, even like some Squier Fenders. Some of them sound really good. I think you can get I think what you need to find is one that feels good. And then you could spend a couple $100 on upgrading some of the components, upgrade your pickups, upgrade your bridge and the nut, and get some good strings on there. And you can have a great sounding bass for like $500 or $600.
Yeah. So there you go. That's how to play bass for guitar players. Huge thanks to my good friend, Philip Conrad, for coming by and sharing his expertise. I'll have all of his stuff linked down below, Instagram, everything. You should go follow him there. Also, Phil, back in 2019, did an amazing solo project called Kudzu Hill that I actually got to play on, that we recorded part of here. And I'll have that link down below. You should go listen to that. It's amazing. Anyways, that's going to do it for today's video. My name is Rhett Shull. Thank you guys so much for watching. And remember, there is no plan B.